Games can actually teach us a lot about life. At the risk of sounding like some video game addict or some sociopath, what I'm really talking about is essentially game theory, which is an area of study that is based in mathematics and economics, where over the past century, these brilliant theorists, they've come to the ultimate realization that life and many of its happenings are essentially games. Now, as strange as that seems, when you logically deduce what a game is as they have, it is essentially a scenario or a situation where you have a lot of participants, a lot of players, and they're all trying to offer a certain outcome, maybe to win, and they all act and behave in order to try and realize this outcome, and by doing so they influence one another, the scenario, and ultimately the outcome as well. And of course that is a working definition of what a game is, the games that we play. But from that perspective, we realize that life and many of its permutations are games, and that essentially every day, just by living life, we are playing a game. And the things that we do in life, our involvement in life and society, there are different types of games. Our relationships, our work, business, politics, economics, even war, they are all games. And we are all executing different strategies to try and achieve the outcome that we want. And that's the thing we're not aware of. We're playing games, we're adopting strategies. Now, you might not think you're being strategic about living life, but we all are. One of the most common strategies that we all use by default, really, is a strategy known as a Nash strategy. That's essentially where you try and realize your best optimal outcome by pursuing your own self-interest, to act in your best interest and increase the probabilities and the chances of realizing what you want. Now, we can imagine, for example, as an illustration, let's say you want to buy this jacket and you want to find a jacket. You might survey several different stores to find the cheapest one for you so that you can ultimately get the best value buy. And if you do, then you have achieved what you want. And that is an example. When you think about businesses, their objective is to win customers. They would focus on their companies and how they're operating, maybe to reduce the cost of their products so they can win one customer from another business. And maybe, let's say they're a jacket business, to win you. And of course, they're doing that every day. This is probably one of the most conventional strategies that is often used in all sorts of games. And the reason why we use it, I think, as well, is it's quite instinctive, isn't it? We are all by nature quite self-interested, so it is quite instinctive for us to pursue things in our own best interests and increase our own probabilities to really focus on ourselves and pursue this linear sort of path. But the very interesting thing about game theory is that different strategies apply for different games, and we can't always use the same strategy. One of the most counterintuitive lessons about life we can learn from game theory is that this self-interest / best interest strategy does not always work. Sometimes it can also lead to very disastrous outcome, as counterintuitive as that seems. For example, there were two amazing game theorists, Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher, and they have actually shown us that in certain games, it is actually best to not act in our self-interest, but to consider the interests of others. And actually by doing so and acting in their interests too, we all win. And to illustrate this point, they came up with this brilliant thought experiment known as the prisoner's dilemma, where if you were to imagine, now in this extreme case where there were two burglars and they were caught and they were arrested by the police and about to be prosecuted. And these prosecuting officers, they separate them into different interrogation rooms and eventually present them a deal. They say to each of them the same things. Now, separately, but the same things. Now, if you were to both confess, both of you would get 5 years in prison. Now, if both of you do not confess, none of you confess, then both of you will still be charging at 1 year. Or if one of you confesses and the other person doesn't, then the one that confesses gets to walk away free while the other person would have to go to jail for 10 years. In this scenario, which is quite often in movies, but also in real life, oftentimes the criminals would actually both confess because they both want to try and get the outcome where they walk away free. But what they don't realize is that both of them are oftentimes acting in their own self-interest and choosing this option that they both actually lose. And so that's exactly the point. They would win by actually considering the interests of each other and cooperating if they can, and at least trusting in the fact that the other person has their interests at heart as well. But oftentimes by acting greedy by nature, the outcome is usually where they both would actually have to go to jail for 5 years because they both would have confessed Whereas if they both did not confess and trust in the fact that the other person would not screw the other person over, they would potentially only have a 1-year sentence. Now, this is a very extreme example, of course, but we can also see it very much applied in life. Now, consider the example business I mentioned earlier, where the company is trying to win the customer and they maybe focus on the strategy of reducing their price, and they reduce the price to capture the customer to present a better proposition. The other company acting in their own interest might be doing the exact same thing. So when they start competing with each other, they are trying to compete for the lowest price, and eventually they enter a price war where eventually the industrial margins actually gets diminished and all of the players actually lose. And that happens many times in business, many real life examples, of course, of this happening, how price war can wipe out an entire industry of a certain product. At the same time, we can imagine this in the context of sociology. Countries around the world pursuing their own industrial development and really their own progression. But by doing so, they don't really take into account the sort of impact it has on the environment. And eventually over the long term, everyone loses, because if everyone's just self-interested in developing their own country with no idea and no sense of cooperation, then eventually everyone loses. And of course, you can imagine that in relationships too, personal relationships, where we only focus on ourselves and the sort of adverse outcome that results from that. So one of the most brilliant things that we can learn from this is that we have to question the sort of strategies that we adopt every day for these different games that we play. And it's very instinctive for us to pursue our own best interests and to really focus on our own probabilities of winning. But sometimes we do have to step back and consider the interest of the whole and really try and get into cooperation with each other to win the game altogether. And maybe that is one of the keys to win the many games of life, and maybe even the game of life itself.